Close your eyes and imagine reading the sentence, her voice was a warm blanket on a cold night. Now, honestly, did you just feel a tiny shiver of comfort, like someone actually draped something soft over your shoulders? That's not just poetry. That's your brain physically simulating the metaphor, right down to your skin's temperature receptors. And here's the wild part: if you're learning English, this isn't just a neat trick, it's how your brain is wiring itself for fluency.
Wait, really? So you're saying my brain isn't just understanding the words, it's experiencing them like I'm living inside the sentence? That's insane. I always thought metaphors were just fancy ways to say things, not actual physical events happening in my body. Are you telling me that every time I read something like a heavy heart, my brain is literally making my chest feel heavier? How is that even possible?
Exactly. And it's not just possible, it's happening right now, every time you read or hear a metaphor. Neuroscientists call this embodied cognition, and it's one of the most overlooked superpowers of the human brain. When you read A Rough Day, your sensory cortex, the part of your brain that processes touch, activates as if you're actually running your fingers over sandpaper. This isn't just about feeling emotions, it's about your brain treating language like a full body experience.
Okay, but why does this matter for someone learning English? If I'm just trying to pass a test or order coffee, why should I care about my brain turning words into physical sensations? Isn't that just a distraction from the actual learning?
Picture this: it's 2012, and a team of researchers at Emory University is about to publish a groundbreaking study. They bring in a group of volunteers, hook them up to fMRI machines, and start feeding them sentences like, "The singer had a velvet voice," or "He had leathery hands." What they discover is shocking. Every time a metaphor is read, the brain doesn't just light up in the language centers, it fires in the exact same areas that would activate if the person were actually touching velvet or leather.
Hold on, so you're saying that when I read velvet voice, my brain is treating it like I'm running my fingers over a real piece of velvet? That's not just a figure of speech, it's a full sensory simulation? But how does the brain even know what velvet feels like if I've never touched it before? Does this mean my brain is filling in gaps with memories or something?
That's the fascinating part. Your brain isn't just relying on memories, it's using something called sensorimotor grounding. Essentially, it's taking abstract concepts and anchoring them to physical experiences you've had in the real world. If you've ever touched velvet, your brain has stored that sensation in your sensory cortex. When you read Velvet Voice, it reactivates that stored experience to help you feel the metaphor, not just understand it.
But what if I've never touched velvet? What if I'm a kid growing up in a place where velvet isn't common, or I'm an adult learning English as a second language and I've never even seen the word before? Does my brain just skip the simulation, or does it try to fake it somehow? And does that mean my understanding of the metaphor is weaker because I don't have the physical reference?
This is where it gets even more interesting. Even if you've never touched velvet, your brain is incredibly resourceful. It might pull from similar textures, like silk or cotton, or even from visual memories of velvet, like seeing it in a movie or a magazine. The simulation isn't as strong, but it's still there. And here's the kicker: the more you're exposed to metaphors in English, the more your brain starts to build these sensory connections from scratch, almost like it's creating a new library of physical references just for the language.
That's wild. So you're saying that every time I read a metaphor in English, my brain is either reactivating old physical memories or building new ones to match the words? That sounds like a lot of work for something that's supposed to be just a figure of speech. Why would the brain bother doing all that extra processing instead of just sticking to the literal meaning?
Because metaphors aren't just decoration, they're a survival tool. Think about it: for most of human history, we didn't have spreadsheets or scientific reports to explain the world. We had stories, and those stories were packed with metaphors to help us make sense of abstract ideas. If someone told you, "That person is a snake," your brain didn't just understand the words, it activated all the physical and emotional associations you had with snakes, like danger, slithering, or cold-bloodedness. This made the warning immediate and unforgettable.
Okay, but that makes sense for survival, like avoiding danger. But what about something like a heavy heart? That's not about survival, it's about emotion. Why would my brain need to simulate physical weight to understand sadness? Couldn't it just, I don't know, activate the emotion centers and call it a day?
Here's where we need to go back to the early 2000s, when cognitive linguists like George Lakoff and Mark Johnson started revolutionizing how we think about language. They argued that even our most abstract emotions are grounded in physical experiences. Think about how we describe sadness: I'm feeling down, he's carrying the weight of the world, she's drowning in sorrow. These aren't just poetic choices, they reflect how our brains literally map emotions onto the body. When you're sad, you slump your shoulders, your movements slow down, and you feel physically heavier. Your brain is just mirroring that reality in language.
That's a game changer. So you're saying that metaphors aren't just creative ways to describe emotions, they're actually how our brains process emotions in the first place? Like, the physical sensation comes first, and the metaphor is just the brain's way of putting that sensation into words? But then why do some people seem to get metaphors more easily than others? Is it just about exposure, or is there something else going on?
It's a mix of both, but there's also a genetic and developmental component. Let's talk about a study from 2017, where researchers at the University of California, Berkeley, scanned the brains of people while they read metaphors involving texture, like a smooth talker or a prickly personality. They found that people who scored higher on tests of sensory sensitivity, meaning they were more attuned to physical sensations like touch or temperature, also showed stronger activation in their sensory cortices when reading those metaphors. In other words, the more physically sensitive you are, the more intensely your brain simulates metaphors.
That's fascinating. So if someone is naturally more sensitive to physical sensations, their brain is basically a metaphor simulating machine? But what about people who aren't as sensitive? Does that mean they struggle more with understanding metaphors, or do they just experience them differently? And how does this play into learning English as a second language, where metaphors might not even exist in the same way in your native tongue?
Great question. People who aren't as physically sensitive might not feel the metaphors as intensely, but that doesn't mean they don't understand them. Their brains might rely more on visual or emotional associations instead of physical simulations. For example, if you read A Rough Day, someone with low sensory sensitivity might just picture a bumpy road in their mind, while someone with high sensitivity might actually feel a slight roughness on their skin. But here's the key: both groups get the metaphor, they just process it differently.
Okay, but what about someone learning English? If my native language doesn't have the same metaphors or any metaphors at all, does that mean my brain is starting from scratch when it comes to these simulations? Like, if I'm learning English and I read a heavy heart, but my language doesn't use that phrase, does my brain just skip the simulation entirely, or does it try to invent one based on the words I do know?
Your brain doesn't skip it, it adapts. Let's say you're a native Mandarin speaker learning English. In Mandarin, sadness might be described as xinqing qinzhong, which literally means heart mood heavy. So when you read a heavy heart in English, your brain already has a framework for what that means, even if the exact phrase is different. It's like your brain is translating the metaphor from English into your native metaphorical system, and then simulating it based on that. The more you're exposed to English metaphors, the more your brain builds direct simulations for them, bypassing the translation step entirely.
That's a huge relief, honestly. I always thought metaphors were one of the hardest parts of learning English because they felt so random and untranslatable. But if my brain is already wired to simulate them, even if it's doing it in a roundabout way, that makes them feel a lot less intimidating. But here's another question: if metaphors are so tied to physical sensations, does that mean that the way I experience them changes depending on my body? Like, if I'm cold, does a warm voice feel even warmer? Or if I'm tired, does a heavy heart feel even heavier?
Absolutely. This is called situated cognition, and it's one of the most mind-blowing aspects of how the brain processes language. Let's go back to that Emory University study. The researchers didn't just scan brains while people read metaphors, they also manipulated the participants' physical states. For example, they had some people hold a warm cup of coffee while reading a warm voice, and others hold an ice pack while reading a cold stare. The results were staggering. The people holding the warm cup rated the warm voice metaphor as more vivid and emotionally resonant, and their brain scans showed stronger activation in the sensory and emotional regions.
No way. So my physical state isn't just influencing how I feel, it's influencing how I understand language? That's like saying if I'm hungry, the phrase a juicy steak might actually make my mouth water more than if I just ate. But does this mean that the environment I'm in when I'm learning English could actually change how my brain processes metaphors? Like, if I'm in a cozy, warm room, am I going to learn warm metaphors better than if I'm in a cold, sterile classroom?
Exactly. And this isn't just theoretical, it's been tested in real classrooms. In 2019, a team of researchers in the UK ran an experiment with English language learners. They split the students into two groups. One group learned metaphors in a room with soft lighting, warm colors, and comfortable seating, while the other group learned in a standard, fluorescent lit classroom. After a week, the students in the cozy room not only remembered the metaphors better but also rated them as more emotionally engaging. Their brains had literally associated the physical warmth of the room with the warm metaphors, making the simulation stronger and more memorable.
That's incredible. So the takeaway here is that if I want to learn English metaphors more effectively, I should be paying attention to my physical environment, not just the words themselves. Like, if I'm studying cold metaphors, I should do it in a cool room, or if I'm learning about bright ideas, I should be in a well-lit space. But what about people who don't have control over their environment, like students in crowded classrooms or people learning on their phones in noisy places?
Even if you can't control your environment, you can still hack your brain's simulation system. Let's say you're learning the phrase a bitter pill to swallow. You can't make your mouth taste bitterness, but you can imagine the sensation like biting into a lemon or tasting unsweetened dark chocolate. Studies show that even imagining a physical sensation can activate the same brain regions as actually experiencing it. So if you're in a noisy cafe, you can close your eyes for a second and vividly imagine the taste of bitterness. Your brain will still build that sensory connection, even without the real thing.
That's a game changer for language learners. So instead of just memorizing metaphors, I should be feeling them literally. But here's something that's been bugging me. If metaphors are so tied to physical sensations, why do some of them feel wrong or unnatural to me? Like, in English, we say time is money, but in my native language, we might say time is a river. Why does one metaphor resonate with me and the other feel forced?
This is where cultural and linguistic differences come into play. Every language has its own metaphorical ecosystem, shaped by the culture, history, and environment of its speakers. In English, time is money makes sense because Western cultures tend to value efficiency and productivity. But in cultures where time is seen as cyclical or fluid, like in many indigenous or Eastern traditions, time as a river might feel more natural. Your brain is wired to prefer metaphors that align with your cultural and physical experiences, which is why some English metaphors might feel clunky or confusing at first.
That makes so much sense. So if I'm learning English, I shouldn't just accept every metaphor at face value, I should be asking myself, does this align with how I experience the world? And if it doesn't, maybe I need to find a way to bridge the gap, like creating my own physical associations for the metaphor. But here's another thought: if metaphors are so tied to culture, does that mean that some people are naturally better at learning them because their native language's metaphors overlap more with English?
Yes, and this is where things get really interesting for language learners. Let's take a look at a 2021 study from the University of Edinburgh. Researchers compared how quickly speakers of different languages learned English metaphors. They found that speakers of languages with similar metaphorical systems, like German or Dutch, picked up English metaphors faster than speakers of languages with very different systems, like Mandarin or Arabic. But here's the twist: the speakers of languages with no metaphorical overlap didn't struggle as much as you'd think. Their brains were actually more flexible, almost like they were starting with a blank slate and building new simulations from the ground up.
That's so encouraging. So even if my native language doesn't share metaphors with English, my brain isn't at a disadvantage, it's just taking a different path to fluency. But let's talk about the flip side: what happens when metaphors don't work? Like, when I read a metaphor and it just feels flat or confusing, is that a sign that my brain is struggling to simulate it, or is it just a bad metaphor?
It could be either, but more often than not, it's a sign that your brain is missing a key piece of the simulation puzzle. Let's say you read the metaphor, her anger was a wildfire. If you've never seen a wildfire or experienced the heat and destruction of one, your brain might struggle to simulate the intensity of the emotion. But here's the cool part: you can train your brain to fill in those gaps. Watch documentaries about wildfires, look at images, or even just imagine the sensation of heat and smoke. The more you build those physical associations, the more vivid the metaphor becomes.
That's such a practical tip. So instead of just memorizing metaphors, I should be experiencing them, whether that's through media, imagination, or even changing my physical environment. But let's zoom out for a second. If metaphors are so deeply tied to physical sensations, does that mean that people who are more physically active or in tune with their bodies might have an advantage when it comes to learning language? Like, if I'm an athlete or a dancer, am I going to pick up metaphors faster than someone who's more sedentary?
There's actually some evidence to suggest that's true. In 2018, researchers at the University of Chicago studied how physical activity levels correlated with metaphor comprehension. They found that people who engaged in regular physical activity like sports, dance, or even yoga showed faster and more accurate responses to metaphors involving movement, like grasping an idea or falling in love. Their brains were already primed to simulate physical actions, so the metaphors felt more natural and immediate. But here's the kicker: it wasn't just about being physically fit, it was about being aware of your body. People who practiced mindfulness or body awareness exercises showed similar benefits, even if they weren't athletes.
That's amazing. So if I want to improve my English fluency, I should be moving my body, not just studying flashcards? Like, if I'm learning the phrase jump to conclusions, I should literally jump while saying it, or if I'm learning stand your ground, I should practice standing firmly? That sounds almost too simple, but if it works, I'm all for it. But what about people who can't move easily, like those with physical disabilities? Does this mean their brains process metaphors differently?
This is where the brain's adaptability really shines. People with physical disabilities might not be able to simulate metaphors in the same way, but their brains compensate by relying more on other sensory or emotional associations. For example, someone who can't walk might not feel the metaphor take a step back in their legs, but they might visualize it or associate it with a memory of moving backward. The brain is incredibly resourceful, and it finds ways to ground metaphors in whatever experiences are available. In fact, some studies suggest that people with disabilities might even develop stronger metaphorical thinking as a way to compensate for the lack of physical simulation.
That's so inspiring. It really drives home the point that the brain is always finding creative ways to make sense of language, no matter the circumstances. But let's talk about the dark side of this for a second. If metaphors can create such vivid physical sensations, does that mean they can also hurt us? Like, if I read a violent metaphor, can it actually trigger a physical stress response? And if so, does that mean that the way we use language, especially in media or politics, could be literally shaping how people feel on a bodily level?
Absolutely. This is one of the most concerning and least discussed aspects of embodied cognition. Let's talk about a 2016 study from the University of Pennsylvania. Researchers exposed participants to violent metaphors like a crushing defeat or a stab in the back, while monitoring their physiological responses. What they found was alarming. Even though the participants knew the metaphors weren't literal, their bodies still reacted as if they were under threat. Their heart rates increased, their muscles tensed, and their cortisol levels spiked. The brain doesn't just simulate the metaphor, it prepares the body for the real physical danger it represents.
That's terrifying. So every time I read a news headline like "The economy is bleeding," my brain isn't just understanding the words, it's triggering a stress response, like I'm actually witnessing a trauma? And this isn't just about violent metaphors either. What about something like "a weight on my shoulders"? If I read that over and over, could it actually make me feel physically weighed down, even if nothing's wrong?
Yes, and this is why the language we use matters so much more than we realize. Think about how often we hear metaphors like the weight of the world or carrying a burden in everyday conversation. These aren't just figures of speech, they're shaping how we physically experience our lives. In 2020, researchers at Stanford found that people who frequently used or were exposed to metaphors involving physical weight, like a heavy workload or the gravity of the situation, reported higher levels of fatigue and stress, even when their actual workload hadn't changed. Their brains were literally making them feel heavier, just from the language.
That's a wake-up call. So the words we choose aren't just about communication, they're about embodiment. If I'm constantly using metaphors that make me feel small, weak, or overwhelmed, my brain is going to start simulating those states physically, even if I don't realize it. But the flip side must be true, too, right? If I use metaphors that make me feel strong, light, or empowered, could that actually improve my physical and mental state?
Exactly. This is where the power of language gets really exciting. Let's talk about a study from the University of California, Los Angeles, where researchers had participants read empowering metaphors like "I am a rock" or "I stand tall" before giving a speech. The results were incredible. The participants who read the metaphors not only felt more confident but also showed measurable improvements in posture, voice strength, and even grip strength. Their brains weren't just processing the words, they were embodying the confidence, and their bodies followed suit. This is why affirmations work, and it's also why the language we use in self-talk can have such a profound impact on our well-being.
That's so empowering. So if I'm learning English, I shouldn't just be memorizing vocabulary, I should be choosing metaphors that make me feel the way I want to feel. Like, if I want to feel resilient, I should be reading and using metaphors about strength or endurance. But here's a thought: if metaphors can shape how we feel physically, could they also shape how we learn? Like, if I'm studying for a test and I keep telling myself this material is a mountain to climb, could that actually make the learning process feel more exhausting than if I used a different metaphor?
That's a brilliant observation, and the answer is yes. In 2019, a team of educational psychologists ran an experiment where they gave students different metaphors to describe the learning process. One group was told, "Learning is a journey," while another was told, "Learning is a battle." The students who used the journey metaphor reported feeling more motivated and less stressed, and they actually performed better on tests. Their brains had simulated the learning process as something exploratory and rewarding, rather than something combative and exhausting. This is why the metaphors we use in education matter so much. They're not just framing the experience, they're shaping it.
That's a total paradigm shift. So if I'm teaching English or even just learning it, I should be paying attention to the metaphors I use to describe the process. Instead of saying, "I'm struggling with this grammar," I could say, "I'm exploring this grammar," and my brain might actually make the learning process feel more open and less frustrating. But let's bring this back to fluency. If metaphors are so tied to physical sensations, does that mean that the more I feel the language, the more fluent I'll become?
That's the million-dollar question, and the answer is a resounding yes. Fluency isn't just about knowing the words, it's about embodying the language. Think about how children learn their first language. They don't just memorize vocabulary, they live it. They run when they hear run, they laugh when they hear funny, and they shiver when they hear cold. Their brains are building sensory simulations from day one, and that's what makes the language feel natural. As adults learning a second language, we often skip this step. We focus on grammar rules and flashcards, but we forget to feel the words. The more you can engage your body in the learning process, whether through movement, imagination, or environment, the more your brain will treat English as a lived experience, not just an abstract system.
That's the missing piece I've been looking for. I've always thought of fluency as something that happens in my head, but it's actually something that happens in my whole body. So if I want to get better at English, I need to stop just reading and writing, I need to move, feel, and experience the language. But here's one last question: if metaphors are so powerful, why don't more language teachers talk about this? Why is this still such a hidden part of learning?
Because most language teaching is still stuck in the old paradigm of words as symbols. We've been taught that language is a code to be cracked, not an experience to be lived. But that's changing. In the last decade, researchers in embodied cognition have started collaborating with language teachers to develop new methods that incorporate movement, sensory engagement, and metaphorical thinking. There are now classrooms where students act out metaphors, use props to simulate physical sensations, and even change their environments to match the language they're learning. The results are incredible. Students in these programs show faster vocabulary acquisition, better retention, and, most importantly, a deeper emotional connection to the language.
That gives me so much hope. So the future of language learning isn't just about apps and flashcards, it's about embodiment. It's about treating language as a full-body experience, not just a mental exercise. But for now, what's one thing I can do today to start harnessing this power? Like, if I'm sitting here listening to this podcast, what's a small step I can take to make my brain start simulating English more vividly?
Start with your next English sentence. Instead of just saying it, feel it. For example, if you're about to say, "I'm feeling lighthearted today," take a deep breath and imagine your body lifting, like you're floating. If you're reading a book, pause on the metaphors and ask yourself, "What does this feel like?" If you're in a conversation, pay attention to the metaphors the other person uses and let your brain simulate them. The more you practice this, the more natural it becomes, and the more fluent your brain will get at processing English as a lived experience. And here's a bonus tip: keep a metaphor journal. Every time you encounter a metaphor in English, write it down and describe the physical sensation it creates. Over time, you'll build a personal library of embodied language that your brain can draw from.
I love that. So instead of just learning English, I'm going to live it. And if anyone listening wants to try this too, we'd love to hear about your experiences in the comments. What metaphors make you feel the language? Have you ever noticed your brain turning words into physical sensations? And if you found this episode as mind-blowing as I did, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the hidden science behind fluency. Alex, this has been such a fascinating conversation. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Just this: language isn't something you learn, it's something you become. Every word, every metaphor, every sentence is an opportunity to rewire your brain and reshape your experience of the world. So the next time you read or hear a metaphor, don't just understand it, feel it. Let your brain do what it was designed to do: turn words into worlds. And remember, fluency isn't a destination, it's a way of being. Thanks for joining us on this journey, and we'll see you next time.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And if you're still here, thank you so much for listening. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who's learning English or just loves diving into the mysteries of the brain. And don't forget to subscribe for more episodes like this, because the more you understand how your brain works, the more you can hack it for fluency. Until next time, keep feeling the language.